Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. It is my pleasure to join once again with event partners New South Books and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System in hosting an author talk about a work of civil and human rights importance. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that 2022 is an important anniversary for our office, which celebrated 50 years in existence in July, and for the library, who marked their 75th anniversary this year. For the Office of Human Rights, we are using our 50th year to look at and to honor the legacy of Prince George and Teresa Douglas Banks, who advocated for the founding of our agency back in 1972, and who lived a life of service to the county. She ran for office. She taught and administrated in Prince George's County Public Schools. She advocated for wage parity. She served on the first council of the town of Glenarden, helped found Chapel Oaks Fire Department, and much, much more. As she showed her care and attention for Prince George's County, so do we focus ours. Tonight, I'm thrilled to have as co-host the Executive Director of the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, Renee Battlebrooks, as we talk to Ernie Suggs about his beautiful book, The Many Lives of Andrew Young, featuring hundreds of full-color photographs that capture the extraordinary life and times of Andrew Young, and a captivating narrative by acclaimed Atlanta Journal-Constitutional race reporter Ernie Suggs, filled with personal accounts from Andrew Young himself. The Many Lives of Andrew Young is both a tribute to and an essential chronicle of the life of a man whose activism and service changed the face of America, and whose work continues to reverberate around the world today. So our guest, Ernie Suggs, has been a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution since 1997, currently covering race and culture, as well as a variety of breaking national news and investigative stories. A veteran of nearly 30 years as a newspaper reporter, he previously reported for newspapers in New York City and Durham, covering stories ranging from politics to civil rights to higher education. Since 2016, he has managed the AGC's award-winning Black History Month project through AGC Sepia, the paper's Black news curation site. A 1990 graduate of North Carolina Central University with a degree in English literature, Suggs was also a 2009 Harvard University Nieman Fellow. He is currently on the Nieman Foundation's Board of Trustees and the former National Vice President of the National Association of Black Journalists. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, his obsession for Prince, Spike Lee movies, Hamilton, and the New York Yankees is unmatched. So welcome. We are so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We are, yes, thrilled, absolutely thrilled. And for those who haven't had the opportunity, this book is beautiful, visually as well as the text. So I encourage everyone to go out and buy this.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, thank you. It was a pleasure reading it. And maybe, Ernie, to take us or to lay the foundation for this conversation, perhaps you could just read something from the book to give those who have not had the opportunity to read this a flavor.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to. I'll start kind of at the beginning. When Andy Young was growing up in New Orleans in the 1930s, his prominent dentist father, Andrew Jackson Young Sr., tried to teach him boxing as self-defense. White kids in the neighborhood had started calling Andy and his younger brother Walter niggers when they would walk home from school. Dr. Young would playfully slap jab his son in the face, a strategy to confuse and frustrate him. On cue, Andy would flail his arms wildly. "Stop that," Dr. Young said. "Don't get mad, get smart. Never lose your head when you get hit." Dr. Young was talking about boxing, but "don't get mad, get smart" was a mantra that would carry his oldest son out of New Orleans to the middle of the civil rights movement, to Congress, to the United Nations, to the mayor's office of a major southern city, to a retirement filled with philanthropy. Andrew Jackson Young Jr. was born on March 12, 1932, during the Great Depression, just under a year before President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated for the first time for the first of his 4 terms. The economic crisis gripping the nation was brutal, but Dr. Young's dental practice and the school teacher's income of his wife, Daisy Fuller Young, made the family relatively middle class, meaning they owned their own shotgun house in the inner city neighborhood shared by Protestants, Catholics, Blacks, whites, Creoles, and even Nazis. Andrew Young would later say that as sober and disciplined as his world was at home, outside the bounds of school and church and the confines of our little block was the exotic and pulsating city of New Orleans with its riverfront worldliness. Andy Young became fascinated with the Mississippi River, whose bridges he would often cross when accompanying his father on trips to provide free dental care to indigent patients in rural Louisiana. This was his early lesson in the importance of helping others. Andy's grandmother, Louisa Fuller, raised 8 of her own children and informally adopted several others. She read the Bible religiously and was known in the community as a woman who would feed everybody who was hungry. There's a quote from Andy. My life as a middle-class African-American was the direct result of my parents' hard work and frugality. Young also understood the importance of education and the meaning of Black achievement. Even in segregated school systems, he landed at one of New Orleans' best Black elementary schools, which had high expectations for its students and peppered the curriculum with visits from any Black celebrity who visited the city, from Joe Louis to Marian Anderson. Young attended high school at Gilbert Academy, where he paid $3.50 a month in tuition and began running track and swimming competitively. He was also becoming a member of what the great scholar W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented 10th, the top 10% of Blacks who achieved the greatest success and then were expected to uplift the race. Andrew Jackson Young Jr. was on his way.
Thank you. Thank you. That really provides context. I found it interesting, the section about his early life in New Orleans and really delving into his mother's side of the family and his father's and those complexities. Could you talk a little bit about the complexities of being Black, brown, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
In New Orleans, and just, yeah.
Well, as he said, New Orleans at the time, and New Orleans still is an exotic mix of different people and different cultures who've all come in and kind of mixed together. And his family was a microcosm of that. You know, as I said, his mother was Creole. His father was African-American. So those two cultures mixed. And when you put those two cultures together in a neighborhood of so many different varieties of different kinds of people, that kind of influenced his thinking early on. So in the book, I talk about how he talks about in the book how he became an ambassador, or he became qualified and ready for the United Nations at an early age because he had to navigate getting home every day. So he was one of only 2 Black families on his block. And he recalls in the book how on one block on his neighborhood was the actual Nazi headquarters. And I mentioned that in my early introduction. So he had to fight, not necessarily literally fight, but he had to battle every day getting home because, you know, it was the early 1930s. So the Nazi Party was not what it was in, say, 1937 and what we knew of them in the 1940s, but it was still the Nazi Party and they still had a certain ideology. So in New Orleans, for a Black kid to be walking down the street and seeing people hailing Hitler, that was something to him, and that kind of resonated with him. So it was a very exotic mix. And the fact that he comes from a family of a dentist and a school teacher, both of whom were college educated, put him in another different kind of category as well, because you think about it, 1932, New Orleans, the Deep South, there are not a lot of Black families who are at least middle class like the Young family was. So he did have a few benefits. He understood the importance of education. He understood the importance of family because he had that. He was one of the rare Black people in New Orleans who was of that different kind of social status.
Yeah, I found it interesting that his parents couldn't get married right away because his mom was a teacher, and teachers, I actually had not known that bit of history, that teachers couldn't be married. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, we take a lot of things for granted now in terms of how life was, but, you know, teachers couldn't get married. Teachers couldn't, you know, I've read all these accounts of just all these rules that teachers had to have. You couldn't wear shoes. You couldn't drive a car. You couldn't wear certain colors. You couldn't get married. So, wow. So his family came under those restrictions. But his mother was educated. She went to Straight College, which is now Dillard University. His father went to Straight College for a little while before transferring to Howard University, where Andy followed him to Howard University. So his family was very, very well educated. Yeah.
Kyla, I've been doing all the talking.
Well, I I love this book. I mean, as Renee said, it is just so stunning. It is really beautiful. So you did an amazing job putting it together. And I have a lot of questions about that process. So I guess maybe I'll start there. Well, actually, no. I want to lay a little bit of foundation for people who are watching who maybe are not as familiar with Andrew Young. And so all of the many lives, the many chapters. The book really kind of lays out the different sections by chapter heading. But I was wondering, could you just give an overview to people who maybe aren't as familiar with him, like all of the different roles and functions that he had?
Yeah. Well, Andy Young, as you know, he's 90 years old. He turned 90 on March of 2022. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I think for a Black American right now who's 90 years old, I can't think of another man whose life has been as well documented as his. And I talk about the privilege that he had as a child. One of the things that, we really take for granted is that he was born in 1932 to college educated parents who had a little bit of income. It may not have been a lot, but it had a little bit of income. So Renee, you can probably relate to this. His family was able to take photographs of him as a child. So when you think about Black families in the 20s and 30s, of having a trove of photographs, of studio photographs of Black babies, that in it of itself is incredible. So his family had all these photographs. So we were able to kind of go into the archives and get all these photographs, and his mother saved all these letters. So we had that. But in terms of when I say that he's one of the most well-documented people, 90-year-old Black men in the country right now, I think is because his life has, like in the book, The Many Lives of Andrew Young. He grew up in New Orleans. He went to Howard University, one of the premier colleges in the country. And I used to say Black colleges, but he always scolds me that it's one of the premier colleges in the country. He went there. He pledged Alpha Phi Alpha, which is the premier fraternity in the country. And his dean of pledgees was David Dinkins, who became the mayor of New York City. So he left there. He became a preacher in Georgia. And a lot of people don't even know that he was actually a preacher who had a church. He left there to go to New York City to work for a religious organization. He moved to Georgia in 1960 to work for Martin Luther King Jr. After Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, he ran for office. He ran for Congress. So in 1973, he was in the first class of Black elected members of Congress from since Reconstruction. So he was in that class of Barbara Jordan. So after he left that, he became the first Black first Black U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. After he left that, he became the second Black mayor of Atlanta. While he was the Black mayor of Atlanta, he brought the Olympics to Atlanta, Georgia in the South. After he left that, he started the Andy Young Foundation. So he's had all these different lives. And the great thing about him, or the interesting thing about him, is that each of these lives could have been its own book. You're familiar with the LBJ biographies by Robert Caro, who spent all of his life kind of telling the story of LBJ. I could have done that because every life of Andrew Young is a book in and of itself. So when you think about who he is and how his long life and all the different parts of his life and everything, the amazing thing about him is that he's always able to also kind of compartmentalize things. So if you met him while he was the mayor of Atlanta, you may not even realize how significant he was as a civil rights leader. You may not realize how significant he was as a UN ambassador or as a congressman. Had he not left, think about this, and I know I'm talking a lot.
No, that's great.
Had he not left Congress at the invitation of Jimmy Carter to be the UN ambassador, he could have still been in Congress for 30 or 40 years. John Lewis, and the great John Lewis, who died in 2020, John Lewis succeeded him in Congress. And you know how long John Lewis was in that seat. Andy Young would have been in that seat. So had Jimmy Carter not called Andy Young, we may not know about John Lewis. So it's all these kind of cosmic coincidences and kind of cosmic things that have happened in Andy Young's life that makes his life so fascinating.
Yeah, two things actually. I loved his quote about coincidence. That it's I wrote it down. Coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I love that. So when you said cosmic, it reminded me. The other thing that I was struck, and if you have more information, I would love to know, but I think the book kind of says no one knew. But so you just talked about sort of, their level of influence. But was it Andrew Young's father who was a millionaire? He had like 50 million, right? That's kind of
His grandfather was rich.
grandfather.
His grandfather was a wise investor.
Right.
I don't know if he was a millionaire, but he was a wise investor. He also is a college man, and he would invest for different organizations, and he came into a lot of money.
Yeah.
However, when he died, he didn't leave any of the money to his children. So Andrew Young always kind of questioned about what kind of relationship his grandfather had with his father, and what kind of legacy was his grandfather trying to build by not leaving anything to his children. He wanted his children to kind of be out on their own, which they did. But, there was always a kind of contentiousness about the relationship with the grandfather. And Andy Young doesn't know why he didn't leave them anything.
Yeah, especially, in this conversation that we now have about generational wealth and how to build it, and how we as Black and brown people are left behind, and it's built through real estate perhaps, or whatever. But it is as you said, a whole nother book about unpacking that. Yeah.
And there's also and I'm just gonna kind of ramble on, but there's also kind of conflict with Andy Young and his father as well. Andy Young's father was a dentist, was a great dentist, and as you know, when you achieve something, you want your children to kind of follow in your footsteps. So he wanted Andrew Young to become a dentist. The plan was for young Andrew Young to become a dentist. So he went to Howard University with the goal in mind to become a dentist. So he didn't do well at Howard University, which is very surprising that the great Andrew Young, who's achieved so much, he kind of flailed in college. And he admits that. He kind of barely graduated because he was not invested in becoming a dentist. He wanted to do something else with his life. And his father had a real problem with that. His father, when Andrew Young graduated from Howard University and went to seminary, his father didn't pay for it because he was so hurt that he didn't become a dentist. Now, ironically, Andrew's younger brother, Walter, did become a dentist, and he's still in Atlanta, still practicing dentistry. But, that whole family conflict thing, all families aren't perfect, even famous ones like that. But, he did. And his father came around. His father didn't, his father came around and was a very strong supporter, but his father was very disappointed that he wanted to become in those days, preaching was, that was a very grassroots job, so to speak. You didn't pay a lot of money unless you were in a big church in New York City or whatever. Right. So his father was concerned, as a father would be, and was a little bit disappointed that he didn't follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, the paradoxes are multi-layered, aren't they, when you think about it? And I guess, family, sometimes the definition is dysfunction, right? That's what makes families sometimes. But Kyle, I think you had some other questions about sort of the putting together of the book.
I did, although, I have lots of questions, so we can go all over. But I think to your point, Ernie, Ambassador Young's life is so rich and full. And as you say, each section could be an entire book. How did you kind of decide what to include, how to focus it, and how to cover so much in one beautiful book?
Well, the basic focus of it was the chapters, the many lives. So I knew that his life was rich, and I knew it was, a lot. So what I wanted to do was kind of break it down into like 9 or 10 chapters. I forget how many chapters it is. To pinpoint each part of his life, and that made it easier for me as a writer to kind of say, okay, this is going to be the civil rights section. This is going to be the UN section. This is going to be the city hall section. So it made it easier for me to kind of put everything in little baskets, to kind of like get all the interviews, get all the data, get all of my research, put it all in baskets. And I know that it was going to be in one particular chapter. So that's kind of how I wanted to kind of catalog the book. And I think it made it easier for me. And plus, we were on, this isn't a traditional biography. In 1995, he wrote his biography, An Easy Burden. And a couple of years ago, he had a book called The Making of Modern Atlanta, which talked about, how Atlanta has grown into what the great city it is now. This was always intended to be kind of a different book, to be kind of a book that kind of gives you a snapshot of what his life is. And he's admitted And I'm very happy whenever he says that when we're on tour together, that this is the best book that's ever been written about him, because it's something that's very accessible. You know, it's a coffee table book, so you can pick it up and put it down and read it at your leisure and come back to it. And, you know, your neighbors and your family can come and kind of pick it up. And he said something that's very important is that his grandchildren can pick this up and read it, whereas they didn't pick up his biography and read, because, you know, biographies are thick and, you know, everyone doesn't want to sit down and invest all that time. But he was very proud of the fact that his grandchildren really enjoyed the book. So I wanted to kind of make it easily digestible for as many people as possible.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it really is a great history, and I can see it as a family history and the family story and the intimacy of those photos. And to your point, that there are many families, and specifically many African American families in the States, that don't have that kind of visual history. It's pretty amazing. Renee, did you have something, or should I?
Well, yeah, I was. Something jumped out at me. It's actually on page 59 when it's the story about when he moved. I believe it's when he was a minister, and the whole who we are going to vote for and why, because of the judges. So it's let's see. The other thing that was unusual for me at that time was that he said, "Now we're voting Republican down here," and I said, "Well, I'm a Democrat." He said, "You can be a Democrat up in New England, but down here, you with Eisenhower." I said, "Might I ask why?" So could you kind of explain that? Because it was a brilliant strategy. And I wonder, as it relates to where we are now politically, so divided, and, you know, are there any lessons to learn, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact statistics, but, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, Black people voted Republican at a frequent clip than we do now. And the person that he was talking to was Mr. Dobbs, who is Maynard Jackson's grandfather, who was a very prominent figure here in Atlanta and a prominent figure in the South and in Georgia at that time. And what he wanted to do, he wanted to come to Thomasville, where Andy Young was preaching at the time, and have a voter registration drive. And he wanted to kind of explain, I think this was one of the first times that Andy Young got a real understanding of politics. And at that time, again, when voting Democrat wasn't always the most prudent thing to do, and, you know, he wanted him to kind of see that there are Republicans that we need, there are Democrats that we need, but down here, we need those Republicans who are going to be on our side and who are going to, you know, we all know what happened during the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and how Republicans helped pass some of those laws and how Democrats abandoned those and moved on to become Dixiecrats and whatever. So Mr. Dobbs was kind of trying to teach him early on that both parties can be of our benefit if we kind of understand what they were all about. Now, that's all changed, or some people say that's all changed now. But that was kind of one of his first lessons in politics. And it came from the grandfather and the man he would succeed as mayor of Atlanta, which in and of itself is another great story about just how this man, you know, 20, 30 years earlier was giving him political lessons that he was able to kind of see being implemented by Maynard Jackson, and he was able to kind of emulate as the mayor of Atlanta following Maynard Jackson.
Yeah, fascinating vignette. Yeah,
because and also because Andy Young, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Andy Young still kind of understands that as a politician, because a lot of times, you know, people think of Andy Young now mostly as a politician, more so than a civil rights leader, and he's become a shrewd politician because he understands people and he can get along with people and he can cross over both sides of the aisles, Republican or Democrats. A lot of his friends, you know, he'll talk a lot about his friends who are Republicans. He doesn't agree with their policies, but he understands that sometimes you need to be on the same, try to build a consensus with them to get what you want and to get what you need.
Renee and I believe we're just talking about this just yesterday.
Yeah.
So there was so much about this book that's timely. And that's one of the things that Renee and I have been talking about too, is that the story of Andrew Young and his work and his efforts, that they resonate and they're so needed, like right now in this moment. And one of the things that I have many questions on that theme, but there's one where in the book, Andrew Young reflects, and I'm just going to read the quote. The night before he, speaking of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., went to Memphis, I didn't know he was going. We had a meeting with Harry Belafonte, Gary, Indiana Mayor Dick Hatcher, and John Conyers, the congressman from Detroit. They were talking about how the real challenge was to get energy and vitality of the civil rights movement into politics. And I read that and I thought, getting the energy and vitality of the civil rights movement into politics. How much do you see that that is still the challenge for today?
I think that's a big challenge. And what he was talking about for the listeners out there is that right before Martin Luther King Jr. died, he would have conversations with Andy Young, and they were kind of trying to figure out what the next phase of the civil rights movement was going to be. We had already passed the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, the Voting Rights Act, and what was going to be the next phase. And, and Martin Luther King's thought was the next phase was to get into politics, to get into those seats, to get into those congressional seats that in 1972 and 1973, Barbara Jordan and Andrew Young got into, to be a force in Congress. And Andy's philosophy early on, and with Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, was that who was going to be that person, who was going to be those people to kind of carry the ball forward. Now, again, he didn't know that Martin Luther King Jr. was going to die, and nobody expected him to die, soon after Martin Luther King Jr. said this. But he was preparing them for what the next phase would be. You saw it in Jesse Jackson. You see it in Andrew Young. That politics was going to be the next kind of phase on that. And I think that that's where it is. I think that the civil rights movement now, it's kind of come out of the streets a little bit. We still have Black Lives Matter, and we still had all the stuff that happened in 2020, the grassroots. But where the action is, and where the action Andy Young believes is in politics, is in running for mayor, it's in being on the city council. And as you can see, what's going on now in terms of just how Republicans are trying to fill school board seats and how they're trying to fill city council seats, that there is a plan, and there could be a plan. And if you plan ahead, and if you have a strategic way to kind of get these seats and then kind of build your coalitions, that it could work. And that's what they were talking about in 1966. What is going to be our plan to be a force, not only in the streets, but when we're starting to make these policies, or when policies are starting to being made, how can we be at the table?
Yeah, boy, 53 years ago.
Yeah.
Something you said about sort of, politics and making the civil rights movement, that's the next step. I was struck by the story, and I wish you would explain to those that are listening and again, that haven't had the opportunity. But so when Mr. Young becomes the UN ambassador and the first Chinese delegation comes, and talk about food and sort of, that real moment of really showing us, I think, teaching us what politics is, that it has a foundation in commonality, and right as the antithesis of what we are, seeing today. So if you could just that story, I thought was very enlightening and refreshing.
Again, I think that kind of goes back to his upbringing in New Orleans about how to engage with people. And what the story Renee is talking about is that when he was a UN ambassador, different delegations would obviously come to the United States and want to talk. And it was kind of sometimes difficult, or for him to kind of be able to relate to some of these delegations, because he's a Black man. He's a Black man in America representing Jimmy Carter. And at this point, the Chinese delegation came over, and he had noticed that the white or some of the other United States officials were having superficial conversations with the Chinese about Chinese food, or about stereotypical things that, stereotypical things that you would expect someone to talk to someone who had no idea what China was about to talk about. So he and his wife kind of started to notice this kind of stuff, and they kind of wanted to kind of get a better understanding of who their Chinese partners were, who their Chinese friends were. And they invited them over. If we're going to talk about food, let's invite them over for dinner. So Andrew Young's first wife's mother was in town, who's from Alabama. His first wife is from Alabama. And one of the members of the Chinese delegation asked, where can we get some good food in America? And he said, you can get it at my house. Nice. So the Chinese delegation came to his house. His mother cooked ribs and all these collard greens and all these Southern foods. That was literally the best food in town, as you can imagine. This is great Southern food. And they sat on the floor and ate, and they had a real conversation about policy and about the world and about United States and China policies and how to kind of move forward. So he was able to kind of break that chain or break that barrier with these delegations, and he did it with all different kind of delegations, which also kind of got him in trouble, as you can imagine, on some occasions. But he was able to kind of use something as simple as food and understanding a culture to kind of break ice and kind of help build that, kind of relationship with the United States and China. So that was just one of the many, many examples of how he used unconventional methods to kind of break through. Because you got to admit, he's a Black United States ambassador, and we hadn't seen that before. The world hadn't seen that before. So, so at some point, he had to kind of figure out different ways to do his job.
I just think it's such a valuable lesson and something that we can all emulate, right? We find the common ground. What is, food, breaking bread together, enjoying time. And I remember the end of that story, and maybe it wasn't the Chinese delegation, but, using food and having people come over that, people stayed well past and talked and enjoyed fellowship. And it's hard to then not listen to somebody when they have a different political view if you have established a relationship. So you don't have to agree, but you can listen and try and find common ground within those diverse views. So I loved that. I loved
and
that.
You can disagree cordially, these are ways to kind of disagree cordially as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he knew that he wasn't going to leave, that they weren't going to leave his house 100% in agreement with everything, but at least they were on a road to some kind of common ground.
That's right. You can humanize somebody. It makes it a whole lot harder to to be vile and So Kyla, I'm doing all the talking.
I have a couple of questions about and you mentioned the fact that he could have stayed as a congressperson for a very long time. And he resigned his position to take the ambassadorship from Jimmy Carter. And so, first of all, I thought that was awesome. And I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Audrey Young that brought this to bear.
Oh, sure. They met in the 1960s. Of course, Jimmy Carter was the former governor of Georgia at the time when Andy Young was, actually, this is after the Civil Rights Movement, but Jimmy Carter was a very significant political figure in the 1960s in Georgia. So their paths came across several times. And honestly, and Andy Young will tell you that he didn't trust Jimmy Carter initially. He didn't like Jimmy Carter initially because Jimmy Carter had, there was a racist sheriff in one of the small towns. I can't remember exactly what it was. There was a racist sheriff in one of the small towns that had arrested Andy Young and Martin Luther King Jr. at some point. And at an early meeting between Andy Young and Jimmy Carter, Andy Young asked about that sheriff. And Jimmy Carter said, "Oh, yeah, he's a good friend of mine. I love him." And at that point, it planted a seed in Andy Young's mind that if this man from Plains, Georgia, liked this racist sheriff, then what kind of man is this man from Plains, Georgia? So that was kind of his initial reaction to him. But they became friends later on because Jimmy Carter kind of recognized in Andy Young his ability to cross the aisle, his ability to make deals and to kind of be that person who can go in and negotiate. One of the things about Andy Young in the Civil Rights Movement is that there's another man named Hosea Williams. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hosea Williams, but he was the person who was walking with John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He was standing right next to him. If you watch Real Housewives of Atlanta, I don't know if any of the viewers watch. You don't have to.
But the viewers might. The viewers might.
There we go.
You don't have to admit you're watching. But Portia Williams, Hosea Williams is Portia Williams' grandfather.
Oh,
just to put it into modern context. But Hosea Williams was, as young people would say now, off the chain. So he would want to go into some place and he would want to rabble rouse and do all this kind of stuff. He would go into communities and scare white people. Andy Young would go into the communities to kind of calm them down. And it was all a strategy. It was all a strategy that he would go in and scare them. Then Andy Young would come in and calm them down and say, "Hey, Hosea's going to do this unless you do this. And I can get, we can do this and it can be a calm and peaceful event." So Jimmy Carter kind of recognized that Andy Young was kind of a person who can make deals and kind of, facilitate calm and facilitate conversations. So that's how they kind of met. And, by them both being in Georgia, by them both being in Atlanta, based in Atlanta, they became friends. So when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and Andy Young supported him when he was running for president, when he became president, he thought that the best person to have by his side as his UN ambassador would be Andy Young. And Andy Young, Andy Young, and it's in the book, he's always kind of been an accidental person. He didn't want to run for mayor. He didn't want to run for Congress. He didn't want to be the UN ambassador. But he's always kind of convinced, and people have always kind of convinced him that we need you to do this. We need you to be the mayor. We need you to be the ambassador. We need you to run for Congress. And he finally did it. And, I have in the book that, you don't say no to Jimmy Carter. And he didn't say no to him. And he, like I said, he left his job as a 2-term congressman that he could have had for 30 years to become a UN ambassador, which he knew was going to probably only be 4 years, at the most 8 years. It was a kind of a tumultuous 4 years because, as you know, he was basically fired from that position, but he was fired right at the end of the first term when Jimmy Carter lost. But it wasn't a pleasant end to his United States ambassadorship. But he and Jimmy Carter remained friends. Last year, I think, when Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary, in Plains, Georgia, Andy Young was there, front and center. So they've remained friends all this time, and they talk regularly, even now.
It is a beautiful relationship. I found humor in the vignette about bringing Jimmy Carter in to meet the Black Caucus, and there's nothing he can say, just right.
Yeah.
And the frank conversation that Jimmy Carter had, it's like, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with right, but
but that just goes to show what Andy Young is and how he can kind of see beyond things and kind of go beyond things to kind of look underneath the surface to see what we really need and how we can really not use people in a bad way,
right?
But how we can use our resources, as we used to say when I was online, how we can use our resources to our advantage. And he saw that in that meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus, that Jimmy Carter was the person that they needed as a caucus and the country needed as a president.
Yeah.
There's a quote about his work as mayor of Atlanta, and it says, "You've heard all the things I've done or tried to do, but none have been as much fun or as successful or where I feel we have accomplished as much than being the mayor of Atlanta, a job he describes as the most exciting job that he's ever had." So I want to talk to you about Atlanta generally, but also this is a big statement. And so can you talk about his work in Atlanta?
Yeah, I think, and this is not because, it may be because I did write the book, but I think he is the most significant mayor ever in the city of Atlanta. And that goes against Mayor Hartsfield, whom the airport is named after. That goes against Mayor Jackson, the first Black mayor of Atlanta. Even Shirley Franklin, the first female mayor, the first woman mayor. But Andy Young was criticized during his 8 years in office because he traveled so much. He was always on the road. And Shirley Franklin, who became the first woman mayor, was kind of his chief of staff. She ran the city. Then, 8 years later, she became mayor herself. But Andy Young was planting a seed to build Atlanta into an international city. Atlanta's always been a great city. Hartsfield and Maynard Jackson kind of assured that. But Andy Young, being a former congressman and being a former UN ambassador, saw what was going on in the world. He understood global expansion. He understood global dollars. So he was out traveling a lot, bringing money into the city of Atlanta, bringing projects into the city of Atlanta. So, his daughter, Andrea, who's the head of the Georgia ACLU, always talks about how when she and her father drive around the city, he's so proud of what the city is. And you drive around the city, all you see right now are cranes all over the city because there's always this building going on. And there's an interesting thing. When he became mayor, there's a hotel downtown Atlanta with remember those hotels or buildings that had the rotating roofs? Yeah. There was a blue building. There was a hotel that had a blue rotating restaurant at the top of the building. And when he became mayor, it was the biggest, tallest building in the city. Now you can't even see that building because so much has come up around it. The airport is the busiest and biggest airport in the world right now because of Andy Young's vision for expansion. The Olympics, Andy Young moved to Atlanta in 1960. And I say in the book that that was the second trip to Atlanta. His first trip was in the 1940s, and he stayed at the Butler Street YMCA, which is on Auburn Avenue. And Auburn Avenue was once called the richest Negro street in the world. And when he came to Atlanta in 1947, I believe, the Klan literally marched down Auburn Avenue as a form of intimidation to Black rich entrepreneurs and business owners. When he came back in 1960 or 1951 or something, he said he was driving down the street on Ponce de Leon, which is another famous borough in Atlanta, and he saw a rat crossing the street, and he stopped because he feared that if he had run over this rat and a cop had seen him, he would have gotten in trouble for killing a rat on the street. So because he felt that in Atlanta, Georgia, rats and animals had more rights than Black people. So he moves here in 1960. He becomes mayor in 1980. Not in nowhere on that timeline could you imagine that the city of Atlanta would one day host the 1996 Olympics. So he saw that. He visualized that because he had seen the world. He had been all over the world. By the time he became mayor of Atlanta, he had been to 54 countries. He had dined with kings, and he had, known all these people. He had wanted to be an athlete himself. He thought he was going to be in the 1954 Olympics. So the Olympics were always something that was always on his mind. In 1936, his father took him to the movies to see Jesse Owens run, the 1936 Olympics. So he had this great vision for what Atlanta could be. And when he proposed in the 1980s that Atlanta can one day host the Olympics, people thought he was crazy, but he understood what a vision was and where a vision could take you. And he saw the potential that Atlanta had. So I thought, and again, looking at what Atlanta is now, aside from the traffic, it's a beautiful, growing city that people want to live in. It's had an unbroken string of Black mayors since 1973. A couple of years ago, I wrote a story called Atlanta Influences Everything. And it talks about how Atlanta is the epicenter of everything, of all of America's Black culture, whether it's music, fashion, television, politics now with Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock. Everything about Black America that we know and love is coming out of Atlanta. Therefore, everything that the world is seeing in terms of Black America is really what they're seeing being born out of Atlanta. And a lot of that has to do with Andy Young.
It's fascinating. I was also struck when you talk about the Olympics, like not going into debt, but having a surplus of what, 100 million, I think the book said.
Yeah. Atlanta didn't spend a dime on the Olympics. Los Angeles went in debt. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not Los Angeles. Montreal went in debt. The Montreal Olympics were in 1976. And Kyla, you're from Canada. I'm not sure if you're from Montreal and suffered the financial hardships of the Olympics, but Olympics are generally not money-making events for cities. They often leave cities with a tremendous amount of debt. And Atlanta was not one of those cities. He was able to kind of leverage Wall Street, leverage, grants and things of that nature, and to have basically a free Olympics. And you can see the remnants of it now in the dormitories that are up, the football stadiums and the soccer fields. All of that is Olympic money that is left over for the city.
Yeah. Brilliant. This whole, the first time, as I recall reading, having it a private partnership, not the government, right? And as you said, Wall Street. Beautiful. Yeah. Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in and ask another question?
Yes, but before you do, let me just say for people watching at home, please type in any questions that you might have. We've got time to take a few before we end. And sorry, go ahead, Renee.
Thanks. So it really is going back just for a second to the United Nations period of his life and the P.W. Botha story of South Africa. And I've been there 3 times, and I can just imagine that conversation and the things, if you could kind of describe that, because it was very profound, actually.
Yeah. Well, he had P.W. Botha, the former president of South Africa, Andy Young, and one of his many trips as the UN ambassador to Africa, had a very contentious meeting with him because Botha tried to intimidate him. So he went out to Botha's house, and Botha obviously had a very contentious relationship with Black people. And he was kind of intrigued by this Black man coming to his office representing Jimmy Carter in the United States of America. And he questioned him. They had a kind of not of an argument, but Botha was obviously the aggressor in the conversation and kept wondering when, if I can remember the story correctly, when were Black people going to start killing white people? Or
Right.
when
That was,
you know, when is this going to
when
happen?
was the bloodbath?
When will the bloodbath start? Yeah, because
Yeah.
he was so fascinated by the concept of Black leadership, so fascinated by the concept of Black people being appointed positions and being elected to positions that he couldn't really understand it. So we had this really, really contentious conversation with Andy Young about when is a bloodbath going to happen? When is this race war going to happen? Because there's no way that Blacks and whites can get together and live and work and run cities and countries together. So again, that was kind of another, Andy Young talks about that a lot. And, it was a very intimidating and intense moment in his life. But he was able to kind of talk Botha down. And I don't know if Botha was ever convinced or not, but he didn't back down from him. And he was like, there's not going to be any bloodshed because we understand what we're doing. We understand what's important. And we understand that, if we continue to do what we're going to do, then we're going to be okay as a race of Black people. Because Black people know, if given the chance and taking the chance, know what they're doing and kind of running things. So he had to convince both of that. I'm not sure if he did or not.
Well, I mean, if we follow, apartheid did kind of start ending under Botha, right? Botha.
Yeah.
And it's funny because that kind of resonates.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, and I was going to say about, when Mandela came to the United States, and the first thing he wanted to do was meet Andy Young.
Right.
Yeah.
What resonated with me in that story is on our first visit to South Africa, it was shortly after apartheid, and we were with a multiracial group, orchestra. And so in that first trip, we stayed in people's houses. We were there for a month, and we traveled all over South Africa playing. And it was fascinating because that same conversation, now mind you, this is after apartheid has ended. Uh-huh. So we stayed in Afrikaans houses, that's the white Dutch. We stayed in the British South Afrikaans. We stayed with the Bantus and the Hausa, and we stayed with, quote unquote, the coloreds, for anybody that understands how it was laid out, right? But when we were staying at the Afrikaans and the white British South Africans, that was always the wringing of hands. Oh, we're so afraid, And I'm like, but it hasn't happened. So it's not. And when we would stay with everyone else, they're like, there is no bloodbath. We just want an equal chance to make a living, to protect our families, to, elevate our families. So it's just fascinating how that germ was so entrenched. But anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make it out.
And I guess if it kind of goes, even if it goes back to American slavery, when they thought that, if we could read or if we can swim, that at some point we were going to rise up and kill them because they've been so bad to us. But, so I guess it's universal.
Right. It is.
Universal.
Yeah. Fascinating. Kyla, did you, because again, you have tons of questions. I have tons.
I do. I've got tons of questions, but I do want to ask you a question, Ernie. So let's talk about you for a little bit. You're a writer, you're a journalist, you're an academic, you've done work at Harvard. Can you tell us a little bit, just more about yourself?
Oh, yeah. Okay. All the stuff you just said. Well, I've been at the paper since 1997. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. I moved to North Carolina as a teenager to go to high school and college at the great North Carolina Central University, which is a historically Black college. And I went to Harvard University in 2008, 2009 as a Neiman Fellow. And I've been living in Atlanta since 1997. And, working at the paper, I cover race and culture. I guess that's my day job. I cover race and culture for the paper. I run our Black content newsletter and our Black content website. I do for 7 years, I've run the paper's Black History Month series, which is a very, award-winning series. So a lot of people call me like the Black reporter at the paper, or we have tons of Black reporters. But I've been very fortunate in my career in terms of chronicling Black history. I moved here in 1997, and I still remember vividly the first time I met Coretta Scott King. And just it kind of just blew my mind. And then just kind of going from meeting Coretta Scott King to covering Joe Lowry and to covering C.T. Vivian and James Orange and Hosea Williams, all these people who passed away. Andy Young is kind of the only one who's kind of still around. So I've been kind of fortunate to kind of be in the presence of all these great civil rights leaders that I grew up reading about as a child, kind of knowing them and kind of understanding who they are and, you know, kind of watching their development and them kind of serving as mentors to me. So I've always appreciated my time here in Atlanta, appreciated what they've done for me. I appreciate the paper. You know, newspapers, as you can imagine, as you know, have gone through great changes in the 25 years since I've been here. When I started the paper, we had like 500 people on the editorial staff. Now we have less than 200.
Wow.
You know, so, my goal when I first got here was to work at the paper for about 5 years and then move to North Carolina to run the paper's North Carolina bureau. I wanted to be the North Carolina bureau chief because we have bureaus all over the South, but now we only have bureaus in Washington, D.C. So that's how the paper has changed a lot. So I've had to kind of navigate that change, kind of, I work from home now. I work from home pretty much every day. So this is my office. Thank you. So it's been a change, but it's been great. I've been very blessed and fortunate with my career and my life. And to be able to write this book at this time has been a blessing. Andy Young and I have been all over the country, and we have, he's 90 years old. We have probably about 7 more trips to do this year alone.
Wow.
And some that are scheduled for next year already. So as long as he's going, I'm going. Although I'm, some of these trips I'm like so tired, and he's still kind of going along. So it's been blessing. It's been kind of really, really good to kind of be with him on stage and to be with him at the airport and talking to him, and every time I talk to him, I learn something new about him and about myself and about life and about Atlanta. He's always has something to tell me that I can use.
That's beautiful.
Oh, go ahead, Renee. Sorry.
Well, I'm just going to say, I am struck throughout the book, and also the ending of the book where it talks about his foundation and really how forward thinking he has been his entire life, even if it wasn't planned, right? As you said, people would ask him. And I love what he is doing with food and sustainable and protein and water. All of these things are so life-changing, earth-changing for all of us. And I love if you would just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the latest chapter in his life is the Andy Young Foundation, which again is something that he didn't necessarily want to do. He kind of wanted to kind of retire and just kind of take care of his grandchildren and kind of live the life of a retired former mayor and ambassador. But he started this foundation, and the premise of the foundation is basically to feed the world. He's come up with ways of sustainability, different forms of aquaculture, and growing different plants that are going to be sustainable. So he's always forward thinking. And when I sit down and talk to him about his foundation, I'm thinking about maybe this is going to be a foundation that's going to raise money for scholarships, or it's going to raise money for housing or whatever you think foundations do. But he is thinking so globally about water and about the infrastructure, the electrical grid, and about feeding 6 billion people. And I think that this is the kind of stuff that the Gates Foundation is doing. This is the kind of stuff that Carter Center is doing. He's kind of emulating some of these really, really large, multi-billion-dollar foundations with this kind of little bootstrap organization. Although the Andy Young Foundation is very good, but we talk about the Gates Foundation, the Carter Center, they're on kind of different levels. But when you think about it, like you said, that whole vision of feeding the world and of finding sustainable water supplies and doing stuff on the Mississippi River to build it up, because he's from New Orleans, he loves the river, and he's thinking about that kind of stuff. So he's a visionary, and he's 90 years old, and he's still kind of moving, and still he goes to the office every day. He has meetings every day. He wears a suit and tie every day. So he's still working. And the
We're
foundation
so
is a big
blessed.
thing. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're blessed to have him still in our lives, that he's still helping us move that needle forward where we can't see or think. He's showing us the way.
Yeah. 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 And he's also won Emmys. He has a
That's
documentary.
right.
He has a
Yes.
documentary series where he has like Emmys all over his house. So he's truly a Renaissance man.
Yeah, I actually made a
Yeah.
note. I'm going to start looking for some of those
Yeah.
in my free time. I don't even know what that is. Oh, Kyla.
So what do you think? I mean, for people who are watching, and sometimes in our own lives, we can feel a bit small or average or powerless. What is the takeaway, do you think, for people listening about Andrew Young, and like, what can we learn from him?
I think that what I learned from him, and I think what people can learn from him, is that you can do whatever you want to do. Like I said, he was not a great student. He was not a great student at Howard University, and I know a lot of your readers or your audience probably went to Howard University or obviously know about Howard University.
Right.
He was not a great student, but at some point he decided that he wanted to be great, and whatever he has done in his life, he has been great at it. It's almost to the point where he's been so great at everything that he almost gets bored and leaves it and does something else and becomes great at that. So I think that the big takeaway from it is whatever you want to do or whatever you think you can do, then try to do it and be successful at it. And if you try that, and if I asked him one time, has he ever failed at anything? And he couldn't come up with anything, because he's been, of course he's failed at things, obviously everyone has, but he has always kind of chosen things that have been strategically suited for who he is, chosen things, and also kind of been pushed into things that were strategically chosen for who he is. I asked him once, what would have happened had he not moved to Georgia in 1960 and stayed in New York City, and stayed in New York City and worked for this religious organization. And he said he would have been moderately successful. So he understood that he would have been successful in whatever endeavor in life he would have had, just not to the level in which he's achieved. But he said, I would have been fine. I would have been fine to have a wife. We owned a house. I was a college graduate. My wife was a college graduate. So we would have been fine. I would have been successful, and, I would have had a great life. But because I veered off and took that chance to move to Georgia to work for Martin Luther King, making no money, his whole life went to this whole different direction. So take risks as well.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. There we go.
It is an absolutely beautiful book. We are out of time. I have to say, first of all, for people watching at home, it is a beautiful book. It's so rich. And as you've heard here tonight, you dive in and you're going to want to know more and more and more. So thank you all for joining us. Ernie, thank you very much for being with us. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting with you. And for those of you watching at home, the best way that you can support writers, of course, is to buy their books. You can get The Many Lives of Andrew Young at your favorite bookstore. We also, can you put a link in again for Sarah? This is Sarah from PGCMS. She's been running tech for us. So thank you very much, Sarah. But there's a link in Acapella Books in Atlanta where there's actually signed copies. Is that right, Ernie? People can get it? Okay.
So you can order a signed copy you can get it from Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. But if you go to Acapella Books, you can get an autographed copy of it.
Yeah. So we really encourage you to do that. And thank you so much for being with us. And we really, again, thank you, Ernie. Thank you, Sarah from PGCMS, who all you just got to meet. She's been doing awesome tech for us. Thank you, Renee. And so everybody from us here at the Office of Human Rights and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.